Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Chief Operating Officer at the Holocaust Center. A live transcript for this program is available on Zoom for anyone who would like to use it. Click Live Transcript at the bottom of the screen and click Show Subtitles. The Holocaust Center for Humanity is located in downtown Seattle, just a few blocks away from the famous Pike Place Market. The Holocaust Center sits on the traditional land of the Coast Salish peoples. We honor with gratitude the land itself and those who came before us, stewarded the land, and remain leaders and activists within our communities. You can learn more about the history of the land on which you live and the Indigenous people who lived there before you at native-land.ca. On behalf of all of us at the Holocaust Center for Humanity and the Jewish Community Relations Council, of which the Holocaust Center is a part, I want to express our shock, sadness, and anger at the racist massacre that took place in Buffalo, New York. We grieve for the 10 innocent people whose lives were stolen. Our hearts are with their families and all who were wounded physically and emotionally by this horrific act. We thank law enforcement for their swift response to protect their community and stop the shooter from doing further harm. The attack was a premeditated act of domestic terrorism. An individual fueled by hatred rooted in a twisted white nationalist and anti-Semitic ideology deliberately targeted Black people going about their daily lives. The horror inflicted on Buffalo was all too similar to deadly, vile hate crimes that our nation has suffered in the recent past. An attack on the Black community of Buffalo is an attack on our community, an attack on all. We must come together to stand against hatred and commit to building a world of safety and justice for every human being. You all had so much to say after the last program with Joshua Green on Hitler's courts. We love seeing your comments. The program couldn't have been more timely with the Supreme Court in the headlines, and so many of you wrote to us about how eye-opening and challenging it was to hear about the courts under Hitler. One participant wrote, "Extraordinarily important and thought-provoking. I had never thought about, although it is obvious in retrospect, the cloak of legal process that state injustice must be shrouded in, and the role that lawyers and judges have to play in that." And one more quote that we received, "It is almost 4 hours since I witnessed the video and my mind can't remove the images I saw and facts I learned. Here I am at 77 and still learning about the murder machine that killed my relatives. This presentation will stay with me always." Keep sending your comments and questions, and we will keep the thought-provoking programs coming. That's the point of these programs, of course, to keep you all challenged, introduce you to new scholarship or new ways of approaching this history, and to keep stories living and dynamic. Speaking of programs that challenge you intellectually, I hope you all will be joining us this Thursday evening at 7 p.m., either in person or online, for a discussion with author and journalist Dara Horn. Dara has a lot to say about how we remember and teach about the Holocaust. If you have not yet registered, there's still time to do so, and you won't want to miss this. A link is in the chat. And if you are unable to attend at that time, but still want to hear the conversation, you can watch it at your convenience from our website next week. I want to thank our 2022 Lunch and Learn series sponsors, the City of Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, and the Francis Roth and Stanley R. Schill Foundation. Today's program is the 6th and last in our series, Understanding and Disrupting Genocide. I'm so pleased to introduce Wai Wai Nu. Wai Wai emerged from 7 years as a political prisoner to become a human rights advocate and the founder of 2 organizations, the Women Peace Network and the Yangon Youth Center. Through the Women Peace Network, Wai Wai works to build peace and mutual understanding between Myanmar's ethnic communities and to empower marginalized women throughout Myanmar. Her work also aims to reduce discrimination and hatred among Buddhist and Muslim communities and to improve the human rights of the Rohingya people. To engage youth in the peacebuilding process, Wai Wai also founded the Yangon Youth Center, a space where young people from diverse backgrounds come together to learn, share, and explore ideas, and to promote leadership in social, political, and peace-building policymaking. Wai Wai received her bachelor's degree in law from the University of Yangon in Myanmar and her master's degree in law from the University of Berkeley. She is a recipient of the City of Athens Democracy Award, the End Peace Award, and the Hillary Rodham Clinton Award. She has been named a Time Next Generation Leader, a global thinker by Foreign Policy magazine, and one of the BBC 100 Women. She was a Liberty and Leadership Scholar at the Bush Institute and an Obama Foundation Scholar at Columbia University. Wai Wai has given talks at the United Nations, the US Congress, and many universities around the world. And we are so honored to have her here with us today. Wai Wai will take questions at the end of the program. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to type in questions anytime. Thank you so much, Wai Wai, for joining us today from Washington, DC. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Ilona, for inviting me in this special series. And I'm so grateful to be here. And I feel very lucky to share situations in Myanmar and the genocide of Rohingya in Myanmar to all of you so that you could take some actions to prevent atrocities happening in Myanmar. I would like to share my PowerPoint presentation, a PowerPoint soon. And before that, I would perhaps share a bit of my background and story before going deeper to the situations in Myanmar. So, as Ilona mentioned, I was a former political prisoner along with my father, my mom, my sister, and my brother, 5 family members in Myanmar. Myanmar military basically targeted politicians at that time in previous military regime and put family in jail. For most of the political activists in those days, they target individuals who conduct political activities. But in the case of Myanmar, in the case of my family, my father, we were targeted as a family because we were Rohingya. Only then I started to realize how my identity plays out in entirety of Burmese politics and how it affects me individually and it affects many Rohingya in Myanmar. So it was just 18, I was just 18 when I started to notice how my identity is it's something that different from many other communities and how identity can be a target against the entire population for many forms of persecutions and discriminations. We were released in 2012 after almost 7 years of imprisonment and under the presidential amnesty at that time with the so-called political transition in 2011, 2012. And we were hoping that we, political, like for example, my family, my father, and all of us will be able to contribute to the Burmese democracy transition. But then it turns out to be different for the Rohingya and many other ethnic communities, especially for Rohingya. The military regime, component of the government actually targeted my populations and launched the genocidal campaign. And that's when I started to realize I need to take actions. And then I actually founded my organization, Women's Peace Network, with the hope to mitigate hate, racism, and discrimination, hateful propaganda against my population. So I started my organizations raising awareness among the young people online, social media, documenting human rights violations happening in Rakhine State against the Rohingya populations and advocating for that. That's how my journey began. And now with the 7 years, almost 10 years since 2012, and now that we have a military coup and we are back in the military era again, and the atrocities in Myanmar continue. So talking about Rohingya genocide and Myanmar, we cannot skip the role of military. So I'm gonna start share my presentations and let's talk about it. Let me see. Okay. Can everybody see my PowerPoint? Can you guys see my PowerPoint?
Yeah, it looks good, Wai Wai.
Thank you. So, in the entirety of the Rohingya genocide, the role of Myanmar military is a critical. Myanmar military in Burmese politics, as well as the role that they played to perpetuate the genocide, is critical. Talking about the Myanmar military, it's rooted at the establishment of the Burmese army in 1941 for the independence movement against the British colony. And the Burmese army actually able to bring independence to the country in 1948. And we had a period of democratic governance, so-called parliamentary democracy, from 1948 to 1962 until a military general called Ne Win, who was part of the independent movement as well, staged a coup. And since then, he introduced socialism in Myanmar and started to actually run the country under the socialist dictatorship. And in 1988, student uprising happened against the dictator Ne Win. And the Ne Win had to step down. And in 1990, we had an election facilitated by the military. And the military actually didn't transfer the power to the winning parties. Instead, jailed all the opposition's leaders, including my father, and they continue to rule with the military under the with the military dictatorship. And in 2008, there were political pressure, economic pressures, and all of these pressures put in place. And the military come up with the idea of transferring the power or changing the systems by establishing a constitution in 2008, basically to secure their political power in Burmese government, in Burmese politics. And then we have 10 years of political, they call it political democracy transitions. I call it political opening, and from 2011 to 2020. And we have in 2021, February, we have a military coup. Now we have a military, a revolutions against the military dictatorships ongoing. So throughout these years, at least from 1962 to 2020, the military has actually developed divide and rule tactics and policies against the ethnic and countries' religious minorities. And the policies of persecutions against the Rohingya began since 1962, and that's when they started to introduce many discriminatory laws and policies against the Rohingya. And they were actually over time, they developed until 2016 and 2017 clearance operations happened where over 1 million Rohingya had to flee from their home to Bangladesh. So with that background, I think that these are underlying conditions and challenges that allow military successfully successfully conduct genocidal acts against the Rohingya. That include, as I mentioned in previous slide, the military dominations in Burmese politics, as well as the Burmanizations or the practice of Burma, ethnic Burma, Buddhist supremacy, along with the military dominations and military's policies of divide and rules. And that actually resulted deep ethnic divisions among the different communities, as well as that divide and rules and persecutions against the ethnic communities also result in us with the longest civil war in Myanmar. We have dozens of ethnic arms groups fighting against the military for freedoms and equal rights and self-determinations in Myanmar. Rohingya also had an army after the independence in 1948, but then they surrendered to the Burmese government in those days with the hope that with the promise that Burmese government at that time will give us self-determinations or a sort of political rights and equal rights in Myanmar. But at the end, they didn't keep the promise, and they started to introduce discriminatory practices and persecutions against our community. And that our community, the Rohingya, is the worst case scenario in Myanmar. But again, with these divide and rule policies, they actually have been practicing many forms of discriminations, systemic racism against the many other ethnic communities and religious minority groups. And Islamophobia is part of their agenda that enable them to commit genocide against the Rohingya. Okay. So the Rohingya genocide is a result of, as I mentioned, systemic persecutions for decades, at least from 1962 or 1970s. And it has then done and it did not happen in a short period of time. It happened in a longer period of time, along with many state-sponsored policies, as well as after 2012, with the state-sponsored propaganda and hate speech by using social media, Facebook, and other social platforms. There were so many signs of mass atrocities in Myanmar in early 2012, 13, 14, 15, up to when the mass atrocities happened in a larger scale in 2016 and 17, along with the clearance operations. There was little to no actions against the Rohingya genocide under the whole world watch. And in 2016 and 17, the military launched this operation called clearance operations that along with the mass killing of the populations, Rohingya population, torching nearly 400 villages and committing sexual and gender-based violence, mass rape, and mutilations, and many other forms of torture and mass arbitrary detentions of Rohingya. Along with those operational tactics, Rohingya, about 1 million Rohingya had to flee barefoot to the Bangladesh. These are one of the photos how Rohingya had to flee from their home with nothing. In some cases, like women were sharing their stories that they had hard time to choose which children they can bring along with them to take this days-long journey to Bangladesh to run for their life. And there were many mothers that had to leave their children behind, which they cannot, the children that they cannot bring. And there are mothers who witnessed their children being killed or thrown into the fires. The Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. has actually an exhibition on the Rohingya called Burma's Path to Genocide. It's also online, and it's in the physical museum as well. So if you have a chance, please visit the website or visit Washington, D.C. And that was a massive campaign in 2017, where at least 850,000 Rohingya had to flee within 2 months of the period. And now it's been 5 years since 2016 and 2017. Only about 600,000 Rohingya are left in Rakhine State, in the region that we live in, Myanmar, and they continue to live in apartheid-like condition. And actually, about 150,000 internally displaced Rohingya are living in the camps, in the camps, isolated and with little to no basic human rights or humanitarian assistance. And the rest of the remaining Rohingya in Rakhine State lived under apartheid-like conditions. Some of my cousins described the situations in Rakhine State as living under open prisons. And as I mentioned earlier, 1.1 million refugees are living in Bangladesh refugee camps under squalid conditions and with the heightened restrictions of the freedoms, basics, human rights and freedoms, and with very minimum humanitarian assistance. And about over 100,000 refugees are living in Malaysia, most of whom have no documentations or any protections under any authorities at all. And some about 500,000 Rohingya are living in Saudi Arabia and other countries, including India, Pakistan, and many other countries. And in most places, they don't have any documentations to live as a free human or with a decent human or any protections. And the Rohingya in Myanmar and throughout the world continue to face so many forms of discriminations and hate. And that's the overview of where we are and how we continue to suffer from the consequences of this genocide and without actually justice. Now that we have the military coup, military leaders has been actually committed similar crimes against the similar crimes as Rohingya against the entire populations, since they've enjoyed impunity for the mass atrocities and genocide of Rohingya and other ethnic communities. So since the coup military has now killed over 2,000 people and imprisoned over 22,000, mostly young people, and now we are at the brink of economic and humanitarian and refugee crisis. And there is a nationwide movement, we call it Spring Revolutions, against the coup for a federal and democratic union. This is very unique moment for all of us. When Rohingya genocide was happening, there was no support or sympathy or empathy towards the Rohingya. The entire country was against our populations. Now that once the population started to face similar conditions, similar atrocities and violence attacked by the military, there is a more sense of sympathy or empathy towards the Rohingya and more solidarity, hoping that this will lead to a path in seeking justice for the Rohingya. So in Rakhine, against the Rohingya and throughout the country, military actually continue to commit all of these crimes, including mass killings, mass arrests, forced disappearance, sexual violence and rape and torture against the civilian populations. And Rohingya are particularly targeted for traveling from within the outside of their village and cities in Rakhine State and outside of Rakhine State. At least 1,200,000 Rohingya were traveling for just traveling outside of Rakhine State without permission. So far, international responses have been very, very slow when it's come to Rohingya and Myanmar. Only after the coup, the UN, some governments and the UN has issued some statements. Some governments, including the US and the UN, issued statements, and there is no actions from this UN Security Council apart from their press statement and presidential statements. And actually, US, UK, EU, Canada, New Zealand, and a few other countries has actually imposed sanctions against the military. And ASEAN countries come together last year with a 5-point consensus to halt violence in Myanmar, as well as to bring a solution to Myanmar. But any of these discussions still does not include bringing perpetrators to account and to take actions for non-recurrence. On March 23rd, 2022, like 2 months ago, the US finally made atrocity determinations and called what happened to Rohingya as genocide. But it's long overdue, and for the US, it took at least 5 years to say the crime as it is. If it take 5 years to just name what it is, how can we protect people? And that's how the world miserably failed Rohingya, and many continue to fail many other communities, despite the promise of never again. Although US did not take efficient and effective actions against the Rohingya genocide, there were several international justice processes ongoing or attempts have been made. Due to the strong advocacy by the many human rights organizations and a few like-minded states, we were able to establish United Nations independent fact-finding missions and now United Nations independent investigative mechanisms for Myanmar. And that those mechanisms are investigating what's happening against Rohingya and other communities in Myanmar and creating case file. Although there is no jurisdictions for these cases to be prosecuted. So therefore we need international criminal court having mandate over entirety of the crimes to investigate entirety of the crimes against the Rohingya and other communities. But the United Nations, the International Criminal Court has only limited jurisdiction now to investigate on the crimes of deportations against the Rohingya under the crimes against humanity. So it's the International Criminal Court, it's own initiative, but it doesn't cover the entirety of the crimes against Rohingya people or other crimes committed by the Myanmar military. However, the Gambia, the state, a small nation, has brought a case before the International Court of Justice, which is, a kind of civil case before the International Court of Justice against the Myanmar in violations of conventions against the genocide. So that case is ongoing, and we need support for that case. And there is a universal jurisdiction case brought by a Rohingya organizations in Argentina, Argentinian court, and that case is also ongoing. So far, we have this justice processes ongoing, but it is not enough or adequate to bring justice and to hold the perpetrators accountable and or to investigate the entirety of their crimes against the Rohingya. So what can be done? Now that we have, after the coup, we have a greater risk of atrocity crimes. So we must end the impunity of the Myanmar military. Commitment to the accountability and justice process need to be equipped and provide support, especially International Court of Justice processes, as well as we need to be able to refer situations of the Myanmar to International Court by the UN Security Council. And so these, one way to address these situations is to end the communities, the perpetrators accountable and to hold them accountable. That include justice processes as well as political and diplomatic pressure. The UN and international community must put diplomatic pressure and impose economic sanctions and global arms embargo against Myanmar and Myanmar military in particular. So these are accountability paths that we could pursue. At the same time, we need rehabilitations and rebuilding of the community. And for that, we need to have a stronger support system for the community, as well as the civil society organizations and human rights defenders within the Rohingya community. So long-term support for skill building, educations, and trauma healing, all of this support system must be put in place. Right now, there are organizations and countries donating for the refugees and for the humanitarian assistance. But these are not channels to rebuild life of the community or to give community agencies to live on themselves and to stand for themselves or to heal or to rebuild their life longer, or at least to prepare to go back, to return to Myanmar from the refugee camps. So I think there is a huge gap from the funding and the communities building resilience and agencies on the ground. And that's what needs to be done. I'll stop here and I'll be happy to receive any questions you may have. And yeah, feel free to drop any question.
Thank you so much, Wai Wai, for this very informative presentation and for the overview of the history. I have a couple questions just to get us started, if you will. And one of them is to touch on something you mentioned just recently close to the end there, and that is, has anyone been held accountable yet for the atrocities that have been committed against the Rohingya?
Not at all. So, and I know through the histories and through the history of genocide in different contexts and different countries and in Myanmar, in the genocidal society, it's not just the perpetrators, but also there are enablers. And that may include not just the military, but the civilians, academics, politicians. And none of this, nobody has been held accountable, and there is no jurisdictions or no court to really bring the case to the to prosecute. So there is no, despite several efforts and investigations ongoing, there is no actual court to really prosecute any of this. So that is why it is important that the UN Security Council, the UN Act, the US can actually push for this to create a jurisdiction, to create a court, or to refer situations of Myanmar to International Criminal Court. We know that the international courts and international mechanisms are last resort, but in the case of Myanmar, where we don't have a strong judiciary, or there is no judiciary at all, and there's no independence, capable, skilled judiciary, therefore it is a must and essential that we have an international court to really prosecute all of this crime, but there is very little to no political wills by the US government and other governments to do that.
So as you said, it took 5 years or more to even just recognize this as a genocide. It could be many, many more years before we even see anybody held accountable.
That is so true, and we are afraid that because of that failure, we are afraid that we'll see a lost generations of Rohingya, and a lot of the Rohingya. It is urgent and it's essential that there is a rigorous and prompt actions happening, because Rohingya continue to suffer elsewhere, even if where they find refuge and safety, there is no safety for them at all. There is no rule of law. There is no protections for the refugees in Bangladesh and in Malaysia and elsewhere.
And have there been any countries have there been any countries that have reached out to really support the Rohingya?
There are small nations like, for example, Gambia, who brought the case to the International Court of Justice, or there are small nations like Liechtenstein, which push for the international investigations at the UN Human Rights Council, but none of the big superpower country are taking leaderships or taking actions as they're supposed to, like especially the US. US is now that it was disheartening to see US actually lifted sanctions against the Myanmar military while genocide was happening in 2016 and 17. But now after the coup, they're putting some pressure on the military. They're imposing some sanctions, but it's not enough. It's already been late, and we cannot wait any longer, and you just need to take actions. And it's very sad to see we don't get attention based on where we are located, or what color we are, or what religion we are in this world. It feels so isolated and abandoned. And I think all humans deserve equal protection and equal attention and support, regardless of.
So Wai Wai, there's a couple questions here that ask about Aung San Suu Kyi and her support or lack thereof of the Rohingya. Do you have a comment on that? How can we understand her position and situation over time?
I think we cannot understand leaders who doesn't have a principle and values, on who doesn't live up to their words, and who doesn't have actually principles and values on human rights and human freedom and human dignity. I think once leaders say we embrace human rights and human freedom, we respect human dignity, and it has to be for all human. You cannot just protect human rights of your own, but violate or ignore others' human rights of the other human being who doesn't look like you or who doesn't belong to your group. And that doesn't mean you are you are a principal leader. So there are leaders in the history, and there are contemporary leaders like that we've seen, and we cannot understand them. That's their positions. Aung San Suu Kyi is one of it. Regardless of her history in the past. When it's come to the Rohingya, she showed her position clearly to the world that she's not a principal leader. It might be for her political benefit or whatsoever. It doesn't matter. When genocide is happening, you cannot just ignore or dismiss or take a side with the perpetrators. If you're a leader of the country, you must take actions, and you must you must prevent and punish genocide. That's the obligations under the international law, as well as that's a moral obligations as a decent leader.
Mm-hmm. There's another question here from George, and he asks, with the Western world currently preoccupied with the war in Ukraine, has the investigation of the Myanmar atrocities dropped from view or international concern?
Yes. So as I mentioned earlier, Myanmar is not a priority for the US from the beginning. And after the, Ukraine, it's become even more difficult to talk about Myanmar and to push for any policies around Myanmar. And that is what unacceptable for us. Our people have been suffering equally under this dictators and authoritarian regimes and militaries. Our people mean both Rohingya and Burmese people in general. And there's been killing, bombing, shelling against the civilians every day, and mass killing and disappearance, mass arrests. All of these are happening as I speak. And we don't get attention, and that's not fair. And we need the world to help us to be free, to have justice, and to live in dignity. We deserve that too.
Absolutely.
And it should be though, and it's the moral obligations of the country like the US and many others to stop mass atrocities happening around the world, including in Myanmar. And there are tons of evidences and ongoing crimes, but there is little to no actions to actually hold perpetrators accountable, despite of the statements, lofty statements, I must say, and ineffective sanction. There has to be more coordinated effort to put more sanctions and diplomatic pressures, as well as global arms embargo, and to really put a really serious effort to bring perpetrators held accountable. I think a lot of the countries, including the US, when they approach the Myanmar crisis, they are only thinking about how to reconcile military and the civilian government. It's not that simple. These military leaders are the one that committed the gross human rights, including the genocide and war crimes and crimes against humanity. You cannot just skip that part and try to find solutions, political solutions, bring in political parties together and support the country to move forward. You can't do that. It doesn't work that way. That's how they try to do from 2010 to 2011 to 2020, ignoring the mass atrocities happening against the Rohingya and just supporting so-called democracy movement and giving the military impunity that emboldened them further to stage a coup and launch the terrors against entire populations. If they continue to pursue this path, we'll be in a trap, in a bigger trap again and again. There will be no return to freedom for this country.
Wai Wai, there've been a couple questions, and I'm wondering, will you tell us a little bit more about your own imprisonment and how did it finally come to an end?
Sure. So yes, we were imprisoned under the military dictatorship in 2005, under previous military dictatorship. And we were released in 2011, 12, under this so-called reform, under the presidential amnesty. yeah, we didn't, when we were in prison, we didn't have free trial, or we didn't have right to appeal. We were sentenced to 17 years. Luckily, we were released after almost 7 years. Yeah, and I described my life experiences, prison experiences, as life university. That's where I got to understand the country's the corruptions and political systems and all of this, including the life of the people, especially life of women, and how differently they are, or discriminately impacted by the systems, being just women and young women, etc. And I describe it was a really tough period of my life, because we were put in a prison called Insane, which is one of the most notorious prison in Asia. So it was a really hard time, but it was also a very enriching experience to learn about your own people of Burma, and young people, women, and the country's situation.
And where is your family now, and what is life like for them?
Most of my families are in Myanmar right now.
Mm-hmm. And do they feel safe? What are the conditions like for them there?
Safe in Myanmar now. Right now, nobody is safe in Myanmar. Anybody can be targeted for no reason and can be disappeared or can be killed. There is no rule of law. There is a lawlessness ongoing. Anything can happen. Nobody is safe.
Wai Wai, can you speak all over the world on this subject? Do you receive some pushback or denial from the people that you are speaking to? What do you hear from the audiences and from others that you're talking to?
What kind of audience do you mean?
Anyone? Are there people who deny that this is happening, or that it is happening in such a terrible way?
I don't think I have encountered such a pushback from the general public, but the governments, for example, some part of US government or other governments would say that they cannot take action, they can't do anything, and would minimize the suffering of the people on the ground. So yeah, it has been extremely difficult to explain how situation was bad in Myanmar until the military coup. Nobody would believe that, despite of all these evidences put in place, put up by the UN fact-finding missions. People tend not to believe what's happening, the seriousness of the crimes in Myanmar, especially those who are in power and those who have a position to make change.
Wai Wai, in Holocaust education, we talk a lot about the spiritual resistance of the Jewish people during the Holocaust, and even when it seemed like the world was against them, the way they found the ability to continue living or to resist in all kinds of ways, resist this dehumanization. And I'm sure it's the same for the Rohingya. Can you give us some examples or tell us some stories of individuals that you know and have met, other than yourself, of course?
I think Rohingya community as a whole is very, very resilient because this is like generation-long persecution. We were a decent community, we thrive with intellectual capacities, our wealth, our culture, civilizations, but then everything has disappeared gradually. Yet we continue to stand for our own rights and dignity, we continue to believe lived in human dignity and as a decent human, regardless of the persecution we faced in Myanmar or beyond. People have no food to eat, and many people have no food to eat tomorrow because there is no limited access to food or healthcare or education, anything, both in Myanmar and Bangladesh and elsewhere. But yet the desire to live in free world, free life did not go away, and our community doesn't give up for the desire to live in free life and to bring justice. There are attempts by the Myanmar government to bring back some of the Rohingya from the Bangladesh refugee camp so that they can ease international pressure. But our community, although the living conditions in the refugee camps is so harsh, they did not compromise their principle and believed in equal rights and equal dignity. They did not compromise, and they didn't go back to a apartheid-like condition once again, because they know that they can only be free when their full human rights are respected and they are treated equally. So despite all the hardship, and each and every one of us are affected in many, many ways, in many levels. I am the privileged one to be able to speak in front of you. There are so many people who doesn't have any access. And we have a different level of suffering because it's a long-lasting genocide. Yet, I think we stand strong to live in a free world one day. I mean, it's a lot to do with their spiritual beliefs as well as their belief in human dignity and human freedom.
Wai Wai, just as a last question here, what can we do to help support the Rohingya and to help support the great work that you are doing?
I think the first thing you can do is raise an awareness among people by using social media or any channels that you have. And the second thing you can do is to donate your time and your skills, your energy, and to volunteer for the Rohingya work and work with the Rohingya organizations. Or the third thing you could do is to write letters to your congressmen, senators, especially because we have a Burma Act, the Burma Accountability Act in Congress. The House has passed the legislation, but it's been stalled at the Senate. So we need to push the senators to pass the Burma Act. So please write to your, senators to pass the legislation, and also you can always donate money and resources to the community directly. There are funding available, as I mentioned, for the big organizations and big channels, but it doesn't necessarily reach to the community level. Unless communities given agencies, powers, and resources, they won't be able to stand up for themselves for long, or despite of their resiliency.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing your personal experiences and the work you are doing and these ideas on how we can hopefully help to improve the situation. Thank you so much, Wai Wai, for being with us on this program today. Thank you to everybody for joining today's Lunch and Learn program. Today's episode was recorded and you will find it on our website starting tomorrow. We have so many people registered to join us on May 19th, that's Thursday, in person and online, and we hope that you will be there too to hear Dara Horn, the author of People Love Dead Jews. Join us in person or online. Information is on our website. As you read the news, you will notice that increasingly anti-LGBTQ+ legislation is being debated in states around the country. Join us for our next Lunch and Learn program on Tuesday, June 7th with Michael Soto, the new CEO at the GSBA, to discuss the persecution of gay men during the Holocaust to anti-LGBTQ+ legislation today and how it affects everyone. Our Lunch and Learn programs are possible because of all of you and because we have a fantastic team at the Holocaust Center. Thank you to Richard Green, our Museum and Technology Director, who is running the technical side of this show. Thank you to our CEO, Dee Simon, and our entire staff, Lori Werschel-Cohen, Paul Regelbrug, Jessica Michaels, Julia Thompson, Morgan Romero, Amanda Davis, Devonshire Lockey, Katie Lawrence, and Ali Labs. Thank you again for joining today's program, and we look forward to seeing you on Thursday with Dara Horn and at our next Lunch and Learn program on June 7th. This concludes our program for today.